Hello everybody, welcome back to Vlogmas. This is a different kind of video. I didn't want to end Vlogmas with a sit down video, but that's the situation we're in. Okay, so every year I go through and do a book about the books that I read that year, and I rate them on a scale. And so we're going to do that this year. Normally I pull all of the books down that I read and I get this like giant pile of books to show you, but we're leaving to go out of town tomorrow, so I'm not gonna do that. I can't do it. Now I am gonna be drinking my coffee as we go, and I have all of my books written down in my handy dandy bullet journal. So we're gonna run through them. I'll grab the screenshot of the book so you can grab the title and stuff like that in case you're interested in reading it. And I think the way that I'll do it, I rate them on a scale of 1 to 5. That rating is arbitrary, okay? It is just vibes. It's what if I liked it or I didn't like it. Do I want to read this again? That sort of thing. But I will go with books. We'll see. I think the rating scale might remain arbitrary. So I think just be prepared for that. And it won't be okay. So if you don't know, I read seasonally. So that means in the winter, I read certain kinds of books, spring, summer, da-da. For this past year, for the winter, I read memoir and short stories. So here is what I read beginning in January, and I'll do December, like what I've read in December this year, and then what I read in January and February earlier in the year. Okay. In January, I started off strong with Liberation Day by George Saunders. That was a full-on 5 out of 5. It's a series of short stories. It's so interesting and funny and weird. If you haven't read George Saunders, I highly recommend it. He writes like magical stuff, just kind of like weird premises. He's got a really easy voice to follow, and he's really funny. So I highly recommend. The second book I read was One True Love. I gave that a 3 out of stars, and honestly, I don't even really remember it. And I feel like it must have been memoir, but maybe it was like a lingering book that I wanted to read. Either way, it was 3 stars, which is basically like I don't recommend it. I read The Writing Life. I gave that 2 stars. It was fine. Nothing memorable. I read These Precious Days by Anne Patchett. It's my favorite book of the month. 5 out of 5 stars. Highly recommend. It was memoir-esque. The story was beautiful. I want to live her life. I couldn't recommend more. Then I read Collages by Anais Nin. Short story. I mean, it was like this thick of a book. I read it in a single day and gave it a 5 out of 5. It was great. Then I read Bliss Montage by Ling Ma. Also super magical and weird and interesting. I loved it. It's short stories. Probably, it was one of my like top books of the month. Probably one of my top books of the year. So highly, highly recommend it. I read a book called Lost and Found. I gave it 2 stars. Not memorable at all. I read Runaway by Alice Munro, is one of my favorite authors, so couldn't recommend that more. I read Everything Else is Bric-a-Brac. It was like cute. It was like, I gave it 3 stars. Fragile Things by Neil Gaiman. I gave it 4 stars. Normally, I love Neil Gaiman, but it was not my favorite of his. It was fine. I read a book called Dawn Light, gave it 1 star. Not worth talking about. In February, I read Slouching Toward Bethlehem by Joan Didion. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. And honestly, based off of the fact that I don't think Joan Didion is a girl's girl. I didn't like it felt like kind of like an affluent white woman going into impoverished situations and like talking about them, like writing about it. It just felt weird. It just wasn't for me. I read Field Guide to Getting Lost, 1 star. I didn't enjoy it. And then I read Hallelujah Anyway by Anne Lamott, gave it 4 stars. It was still my favorite book of the month, but it was about 4 stars for me. Then I read Novelist as a Vocation by Haruki Murakami, and I gave that 2 stars. I think it's great. I'm not like a fan of the way, it's kind of like good, bad, right, wrong. There's one way to do this, and I don't respond well to that. I'm gonna flip ahead to this December because we're still in winter, and I'm gonna cover what I talked about this month. I read the book The Power of Now for a book club that I'm doing, and I gave it 3 stars. There are some things about it that I felt like reminded me of like habits and mindsets that are supportive for me, but there were also things about it that I thought were ridiculous. So, take it, read it with your own discernment. The other book I finished in the month of December was Secret Lives of Church Ladies. And that book was an absolute 5 out of 5, one of my favorite books of the year. It was a series of short stories about women in the church and like their secrets, and I loved it. I'm currently reading What My Bones Know. It's a memoir about healing from CPTSD, but I'm still pretty new into it to have any opinions about that. So that was my winter kind of reading for this year. And then again into spring. This year for spring, I read, hold on. This year for spring, I read classics and poetry. This coming year, I'm going to read classics and like literary type books because I don't think reading poetry like all in a row as a book is the best way to read poetry. So I don't think that's going to work for me. But here's what I read this year in the spring. In March, I read Love Poems by Rumi, and I gave it 1 star. It didn't do much for me. The next book I read was Jane Eyre. This was my favorite book that I read in March. It is probably my favorite book I read this year. I can't believe I waited this long to read Jane Eyre. It was incredible and one of the best books I've ever read. I read Devotions by Mary Oliver, and this is where I felt like reading poetry start to finish, like a book of poetry beginning to end all in a row, wasn't doing much justice to the work itself. I think poetry needs to be read one piece at a time and read very slowly and read multiple times over and over to really like appreciate it. And so it didn't fit well for me. So I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I feel like if I had read it the way it's intended to be read, I would have given it 5 out of 5. Then I read Little Women. I gave that 5 out of 5. I read Franny and Zoe. I gave that 3 out of 5. I thought it was an interesting book. It wasn't like life-changing for me in any way. I read Out of Season. My neighbor lent me Lessons in Chemistry, and I gave that one 3 out of 5 as well. Then in April, I read The Bell Jar and gave that one a solid 5 out of 5 by Sylvia Plath. I read it because my therapist references it a lot, and I was like, oh, I should read that. And I read it and I loved it, and it was great, phenomenal. Also in April, I read Emma, also a 5 out of 5, brilliant. My favorite book of the month of April was The Secret History by Donna Tartt, absolute 5 out of 5. April was a really great reading month for me, apparently. So those were all great. And then in May, I read Persuasion. I gave that a 3 out of 5. It wasn't for me. I read How to Tell a Story by The Moth. I gave that 4 out of 5. It's a nonfiction book about writing, and I thought it was really good. I took a lot of notes, but it wasn't mind-blowing. I read Pride and Prejudice, obviously a 5 out of 5. And my favorite book of the month of May was Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. It's one of my favorite books of all time. I can't believe I waited this long to read it. So that is my spring list. In the summer, I read beach reads, just like easy, light, fun reads. I didn't feel like I had a really good reading summer. Like it wasn't notable. So I'll tell you what I read, but I feel like it was a slump for me this year. In June, I read Happy Place by Emily Henry. I love Emily Henry. This was not my favorite of hers. It was a 4 out of 5 for me. I love all of the other books of hers that I've read. This one just wasn't my favorite. I read Maybe in Another Life. I gave that one 3 out of 5 stars. I read Why Has No One Told Me This Before? It's a nonfiction book. Absolute 5 out of 5. One of my favorite books I read this year. It's like a therapist kind of going through and writing about all the different things we might experience or feel. I listened to this as an audiobook and liked it so much that I bought a physical copy because I wanted it in my library for like my kid to reference or to loan to people or to just be able to pick up and read if I want. So highly recommend. I read Devotion by Patti Smith, 3 out of 5. It was not notable for me. I read The Friend Zone. That was a 2 out of 5. Honestly, it was very bad. I read South of the Border. I didn't finish South of the Border by Haruki Murakami. It was a little graphic for my taste, a little not pro-women for my taste. I read In 5 Years. That one was a 5 out of 5 for me. I love that like magical realism book, and it was great. Then in July, I read In the Lives of Puppets. I gave it 4 out of 5. This was another author who I really love. It's TJ Klune. He wrote Under the Whispering Door and House on the Cerulean Sea. Both of those are two of like my favorite books I read the year before. In the Lives of Puppets I liked, I just didn't love it. And I read Guncle, which I gave 3 out of 5. I probably should have given it 2 out of 5 if I'm honest, but it was fun enough. You know, it felt like a summer book for sure. And then in August, I read 6 Days in Rome. That was a 2 out of 5. I did not like it. I read The Dinner List, which was a 5 out of 5. Also, magical realism, just very, very fun, easy read. I read Meet Me at the Lake. I gave that 3 out of 5 stars. Just kind of boring, like fine. I read a book called A Writer's Paris, which I gave 3 out of 5. It was good for the vibes, but it's like actually just about writing a book in Paris. Like, here's what to do if you want to move to Paris and write. And it was less useful for me. So that is my summer of reading. And my fall of reading, in September, I read Clara and the Sun. That was a full 5 out of 5 for me. So much fun, such a fun read. I would recommend it to anyone who likes kind of futuristic, magical writing. I read a book called Crook Manifesto, and I gave it a 3 out of 5. I think the writing itself was like a 5 out of 5, but in terms of like my enjoyment of it, I gave it a 3 out of 5. I read Fourth Wing, which was my favorite book of the month, but it was tied. So Fourth Wing was absolute 5 out of 5. If you like romantasy, like fantasy and romance together, you're gonna love it. If you haven't read it yet, definitely read it. Then I tied that with Magic Lessons, which was also a 5 out of 5. Again, it felt like I found Alice Hoffman, like my new favorite author, and can't wait to read more and more and more of her work. Then in October, I read The Penelopiad, kind of about the underworld and the Greek mythology. I gave it a 4 out of 5. It was a fun read. It wasn't mind-blowing, but it was fun. Then I read The Rules of Magic, Practical Magic, and Book of Magic, all by Alice Hoffman, all part of the Practical Magic series. All of them got 4 stars, except for The Rules of Magic, I gave 5 stars, and that was my favorite book I read in October. And then I read Broke Millennial, which is a nonfiction book, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. It was fine. And then finally in November, I read Good Girl's Guide to Murder, 5 out of 5, so fun. Such a fun read. It was exactly what I was looking for. I wanted like a mystery, kind of puzzly book. I hadn't read one like that in a while, and it did the job. I read The Ex-Hex. It was fine. It was a 3 out of 5. Not like nothing to write home about, you know. Then I read Iron Flame, which is the sequel to Fourth Wing, and y'all, I read that in too short of time, like less than a week. And then it's going to be a long time before there's another book, and I regretted doing that because now I have to wait to find out what happens, way too long. So, but it was my favorite book of the month. And then I read Severance by Ling Ma. That was an absolute 5 out of 5. Incredible book. Super interesting. If you like end of the world apocalypse type stuff, definitely read that. And then I read Handmaid's Tale, and I gave that one a 4 out of 5. It was really well written. I really liked it, but it wasn't like one of my favorite books that I read this year. You know, like wasn't top of the tier of the books. So all of that to say, I read 58 books in the year 2023, and here are my top like favorites that I read. I read my top. Here are my favorites that I read this year. These Precious Days by Anne Patchett, Hallelujah Anyway by Anne Lamott, Jane Eyre, The Secret History, Grapes of Wrath, Why Has No One Told Me This Before, The Dinner List, Fourth Wing, Magic Lessons, The Rules of Magic, and Iron Flame, and The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. So if you guys are looking for book recommendations, those are the ones that I absolutely, positively recommend. I'm going to add Bliss Montage and Severance on there, even though they didn't make my favorite of the month. They were still absolutely wonderful. So that is my full list. This is my last video of Vlogmas. I will be taking some time off of all media. I'm going to be off of Instagram. The podcast is still going, but I will not actually be there. It's like all pre-recorded. And then I'll be back in the new year with whatever the new year brings us. So I will see you guys soon, probably mid to late January is when I will be back. So thank you guys so much for joining me for Vlogmas, for being here on this channel. This is really fun. It's really cool that we get to do this. It's one of my favorite things I get to do. So thanks for being here, and I will see you so soon. Bye. Merry Christmas.